Hi there. So, I'm going to talk to you about two things. First thing that I'm going to talk to you about is the pursuit and distancing. In tendency to incorporate kind of the things that we don't want when we are trying to connect with other. This is true of any relationship, not just domestic partnerships, not just family relationships. This is true of every relationship. We incorporate into the way that we communicate the things that we want, the things that we don't like, and we have a tendency to pursue because we want closeness with that person or because we're trying to achieve something with that person. We also have a tendency to withdraw if we feel like we're being pursued in a way that is uncomfortable or otherwise taxes us emotionally. Now, I realize that I'm kind of throwing a lot at you for a live, but there's a point to this. Often when I see couples, the first thing that I hear from them is we don't communicate well. And so that's why I'm going to talk about this for a second. When we are in a relationship with someone, whether that's a professional relationship, a personal relationship, or even just a casual relationship, think of this: you go to the gas station and the relationship that you have with the person at the counter, you're making a purchase. But the relationship is that you trust that one another are going to be a party to the exchange, whatever that is. Sometimes you walk in and you're polite and you're kind and you say good morning or good afternoon, how are you? Or maybe you engage in a little bit of small talk with the person behind the counter. Now, sometimes this person will respond. This is where mutual pursuit is happening. We're both pursuing for a common interest, and that common interest may be making some kind of a connection. Now, I'm going to break this down into as small parts as I can because there's a point to all of this. That person may not know you or they may know you. Regardless, we're still mutually agreeing to a conversation or some type of an interaction with each other and engaging with each other. Whether that's simply passing the money to the person, however you're paying for the transaction, and they're facilitating that exchange. Another way that this shows up, you walk in, you're bright and cheery, the other person, and they're just looking at you. They take your money, they don't really engage. They're signaling that they're standing mute on whatever the situation is. In that signaling, we recognize this is not somebody who wants to be approached. This isn't somebody who's going to engage in idle chit chat with us. We're recognizing that social cue. Our pursuit is we're just trying to achieve the financial transaction, but we're also trying to connect with this person. Maybe we're looking for something to fill our emotional cup from this person, but this person just isn't having any of it. That's okay. Now, contrast that. You walk in and the person is talking to their coworker. They're not paying any attention to you. They're simply facilitating the transaction. And that may show up as in, they may turn briefly to look at you and say, that's whatever the price is. You make that transaction and then you walk out. That person is withdrawn from you. Now, if I turn this back around to couples, often what happens with couples, in the early stages of their relationship, there's mutual pursuit because we're pursuing for closeness. We want to feel like we're a part of that person's world. We want to enjoy that person. We want to experience as many things with that person as we can. And we want to feel that love, that connection with another person. And because we're both doing this, there's mutual pursuit until we hit something that bumps up against something that is either a value for us or something that we have a strong opinion about. Now, I'm going to use this example, and it can be anything. Let's say that myself and my husband are having a discussion about politics, religion, money, or sex, because those are the four big taboos. And I love that in those four taboos, we have very strong opinions about each of those things because we've learned things about them, but we've also learned these are difficult subjects for a lot of people to talk about, unless you're a CPA, in which case then you talk about money and you don't think twice about it. If you're a sex worker, you talk about sex and you don't think twice about it because you have a different belief system around what each of those are. So you can see how this can get a little bit tricky for people, especially if it's something that we're uncomfortable with. So going back to my husband and I having this conversation around, let's say, sex. He's wanting more, I'm wanting less. The way that we communicate about that has everything to do with how successful we are on the other end of that, but also whether or not we're listening to each other in those moments. Now, often what we miss is that When we're having a conversation with one another, whether it's our chosen loved one or somebody that we just met, a couple of things have to happen. There's a social agreement that happens that we're going to engage in some way in this interaction. But that social agreement doesn't always mean that the other person is going to listen fully before they respond. And this is where couples get into trouble because they'll start to talk over each other to be heard, or because they get excited about wanting to make an answer, or we've bumped up against something and we can feel ourselves starting to get emotionally charged about the conversation. So going back to my husband says, I want more sex. And maybe I say, you know what, I'm exhausted. I just don't have it in me to have any more sex with you than we're already having. And already some of you are already uncomfortable with the fact that we're talking about sex. If we're having an honest dialogue with one another, it really becomes imperative that we be present with each other and that we truly listen to each other. This is hard because nobody really ever teaches us how to do this appropriately as a couple. Now, we've learned about hierarchies growing up because the parents say, I told you, therefore. And they become the de facto experts in our world, as do teachers, as do preachers, as do anybody that we encounter that we think is an expert or has some authority over us. And we're giving them that permission to have that authority over us. And that's the part that a lot of people miss. The reason that they miss this is because it's perceived authority. We've already decided this person already has some type of a means of holding us accountable, or in other ways demanding something of us that we must give. Now think about that belief for a minute. If my husband and I are talking about sex and he says, well, I'm the man and I demand more sex, and because I'm the man, you have to give that to me because that's my right as a man. Well, that may be true in some circumstances, but I may be feeling like I can't deliver the way that you need me to. I can't respond the way that you want me to, for whatever the reasons are. Now, this could be because of a biological reason. This could be because of a psychological or an emotional reason. Could also just be because of fatigue. Fatigue encompasses all of that. It could also be because of a timing issue, depending on the time of the month, my hormones. There are any number of things that can be a factor in that. And all he's thinking is, but I want that. Okay. Now, this isn't to minimize the man and his desire for sex. Don't misunderstand me, and don't attribute something to me that I didn't say. I'm not saying that he's wrong for asking for more sex. He's well within his right to ask for that. I have the obligation as his wife to listen, to evaluate it, and then to discuss with him. Now, this shouldn't be something that becomes an emotionally charged issue. And I say shouldn't only from the standpoint that we're negotiating how much more sex are we going to have or how much less. Now, emotionally, though, he may be passionate about, I really want more sex. That's okay. He can be passionate about it. I can be equally as passionate saying, you know what, I just don't have the emotional space to do this with you. Now, here's the difference. And I'm going to kind of take a bunny trail with you for just a second to clarify a point about communication. When we are singularly focused on something that we really want, we have a tendency to disregard or feel a sensation of either anger, frustration, or other dismay about the other's response to us, because they're not giving in and they're not in a way that we recognize, acknowledging that this is a need for us because we've identified it as a need. Now, I'm going to use this as a for instance. When I'm teaching archery, the thing that I'm thinking about is communicating the basic skills of archery to the person that is trying to learn how to shoot the arrow from a compound bow. What they're hearing is being filtered through their lens of experience. They get to decide if I'm the expert in the room or not. They get to decide if I have the information that they need to help them be successful or not. Last year, I worked with a 7-year-old who he was way up here trying to draw the bow, and then he's way extended like this. And I said to him, you know, it may be more effective if you bring the bow down and you bring your arm across your chest and then, you know, close your shoulder blades at the end of the draw. And he went, uh-huh. So you can see he'd already withdrawn because he decided that the way that he's doing it is appropriate and correct. Does that mean that he's wrong? Not necessarily. In some contexts, it worked for him because when I tried to correct him, he didn't like that the result that he got was not what he was looking for. But again, there's some complexities to this. He's hearing it through a lens of, I'm the adult telling a child what to do. He's hearing it through the lens of his personal experience, which is anecdotal experience, is the way that I shoot works for me. I can sometimes get the arrow to go where I want it to go the way that I draw the bow. Okay. He can choose to decide whether or not to engage with me in that conversation, because I walked up to him. He didn't ask me to help him with his shooting. So you can see he had already withdrawn after I had suggested that he try another way to shoot. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. I could have been offended by that and thought, I'm the one that's teaching the class. The least you can do is try it my way. I don't feel that way, because he's got the authority to decide if that's what he's going to do or not going to do. The same thing is true in my therapy room. I can give you information and tools. You get to decide if those are the right tools for you. That is not a rejection of me. Notice where I'm going. Just because the other doesn't respond the way that you want them to isn't necessarily an all-out rejection of all of you and all of the things that you think. Going back to that exchange, though, with the 7-year-old, had he have turned to me and said, hey, can you help me with this? I still get to decide, am I going to engage with him? I may look at him and think, why, you're doing everything fine, and then turn away. That's, again, not a rejection of him. It's not a denial of that two-way communication. But in that mutual pursuit, we can discuss the finer points of how he can do a better job of hitting the target. Because he chose to withdraw, I chose to withdraw. Now, let me talk about mutual attack. Now, this is what happens often when couples argue. Going back to my example of my husband wanting more sex. He may be hearing my, I'm not interested in having more sex with you, as something that frustrates him, angers him, and he may say, why won't you do that with me? And I can say, because I've got all of these things going on here, I just don't have the emotional energy. And, as much as I might want to, I don't feel like I can right now. In which case he may continue to pursue me. And because of that pursuit, I may perceive that as an attack. Now, this works in the reverse as well. I could be pursuing him for sex and he could be withdrawing, but then he may turn around and mutually attack. In that mutual attack, we begin to argue about why this is something that should be. Now, what we've done is we've taken something that was a discussion and we've elevated it. We've gotten angry with each other, and then we begin to clash with each other. That's mutual attack. But the thing is, all the while, what we're teaching each other in that mutual attack is how to be with each other. And we're also incurring trust violations, because why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you validating my experience? And how that should show up is when we're listening to other, we should be listening to understand, not necessarily to respond. And that's the real crux of what happens here, because we get caught up in, but you always, you never. That's not true. You don't always, you don't never. There are times when these things happen and when they don't happen. And sometimes we take offense to those things. So let's go back to, he wants more sex. And I say, I just don't have it in me right now. He may withdraw. Now, I may feel hurt because he's not acknowledging that these are all of the reasons that I'm exhausted and I really need your support. But if I'm not asking for my needs to be met, like he's asking for his need to be met, but we're not discussing that, then we begin to incur trust violations, because it feels like, why aren't you listening to me? Why don't you care about what's important to me? Why aren't you on the same page as me? This is when couples struggle, because they're feeling like they're not heard and that their partner doesn't understand them. Often, though, it takes a minute for us to disentangle some of those threads, because we've learned, not just with our experience with each other, but also with other people in our lives, that they're not listening to me. They don't understand me. They're not trying to understand me. And sometimes we're just afraid. But the way that we behave doesn't look like fear. What it looks like is outright abandonment or rejection, or we get angry. Well, so if I'm a fixer, and this is one of the things that I see a lot in a therapy room. A wife will come home and she'll tell her husband about something that happened, and he'll start offering suggestions about how she can fix it. And she'll go, I don't really want to do that. And then she'll go off and she'll do her own thing. He's upset now because I tried to fix that for you and you couldn't see it. Well, really what he's saying is, why don't you value my experience, my opinion, and my logic? Because you asked me to fix this. But did she? Probably not, because most women want a sounding board, but they don't ask for a sounding board. Now, This is a generalization. So before you come at me and I see, on somebody else's YouTube criticism or comments about my reflections here, understand that these are general statements and that there are exceptions. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that there isn't a one size fits all in every relationship. All right. So going back to what is pursuit and distance, it's how are we teaching each other to be with each other? And if we exercise a little bit of patience and we slow down and we shut up and we let the other person talk, and then we ask clarifying questions, because often the shortcuts in our brain say, I don't have time to listen to this, or because it's not managing my needs and my wants, which we're trying to put first when we should be listening. So again, I realize that this sounds a little bit confusing, but when you think about it, how are we listening to the other? Are we pursuing? Are we pursuing to attack? Are we pursuing to listen? Are we withdrawing? And if we're withdrawing, what are we withdrawing as a reason? Is it because we're afraid? Is it because we're being attacked? Is it because we just don't have an answer? And sometimes we don't, and that's okay. And it's okay to say, you know what? I don't have an answer right now. Can I think about it? So again, a lot of this requires us to get really honest with ourselves, but it also requires us to get really honest with the other. So going back to my husband and wife example, if he comes to me and says, I want more sex, a way that I can navigate this is I can say, tell me what your needs are. I want to understand how you need me to show up in bed. I want to understand how you need me to show up for you to love and support you. What does that look like? What does it sound like? What would that feel like for you? Notice that I'm not saying, how is that going to feel for me? Because if I'm really truly putting my husband first, I'm listening to understand, and then I'm evaluating, can I show up in that way? And if I can't, I need to clarify that with him. But I also need to let him know it's probably not about him, but even if it is about him, I need to do it in a loving, gentle way. It may be, last time we did this, that hurt. I don't really feel comfortable doing that. Can we do this another way? That's okay. And it's okay for you to feel, whether you or your husband, you can feel what you feel. It's important to let the other know that's what I feel. And it's okay for you to feel exactly what you feel. Even if you're judging it in your head, it's okay to feel what you feel. It's also okay for you to say, you know what, I feel that. Is it rooted in something that is in evidence? Is it rooted in fact? Or is it simply what I feel because that's what I've learned to feel? So is there another way that I could feel about this? Located in your body, where do I feel that? And notice it. Give it some expression. Because often we're feeling hurt. And I might go back to my husband example, and he might say, well, it really hurts my feelings when you do this. And then I can say, oh, I wasn't aware that I was doing that, or I'm glad you brought that to my attention. Let's talk about how we can fix that. Now, I could also take offense to something that he says, but I have to be on guard when I take the offense, because that's about me. That's not about him. All right. So I didn't mean for it to get to be a 20-minute video, so I apologize. But again, I wanted to offer some clarification, because one of the difficulties in couple relationships is that often we're trying to communicate with the other that I need you, I want to feel close, but I also need to feel like you get me and that you understand my needs. And sometimes I really just need you to show up and be in my corner. And we need to identify with each other what it means to be loving and supportive. We also need to identify what it feels like, what it sounds like, the behaviors that we do that demonstrate that love. Now, I know I've been critical of Gary Chapman, principally because people have a tendency to shortcut the book. And they have a tendency to identify their love language, but they don't do a very good job of looking at the fact that communication doesn't happen simply in that one category of love, or in that one particular expression. It happens across a broad spectrum of things. And it's important to recognize that sometimes we miss cues because we think, well, they didn't love me the way that I wanted them to love me. And according to the book, it should be this way. Pay attention to what has meaning for you, what behaviors have meaning for you. I love that somebody I know made the statement, ditch weeding it. It doesn't have to be an extravagant expression. It could be finding beautiful flowers in a ditch growing on the side of the road and bringing those home because you thought about me. Now, that's not to imply that the person is a ditch weeder, that we're thinking about them in the same way that we think about the ditch. It's to say, I saw something beautiful on the side of the road and it reminded me of you. There's a barn east of Sandusky here that sometimes there's a beautiful purple field in the early spring. I think it's lavender. It's absolutely gorgeous against the backdrop of that old faded red barn. And the story was told to me that a couple of years ago, when that field was in, wide bloom, the husband took a picture of it and said, "Made me think of you," and just sent the picture. What a beautiful expression of love to say, "You're as beautiful as this beautiful picture." So it doesn't have to be an exaggerated expression, it just has to be heartfelt. So if you have questions, reach out to me, dragonslayersanon@gmail.com. Thanks for talking to me. I'm Kelly, the Kilted Therapist. Have a great day.